other systems in the human body. So far we've discussed the respiratory system. We've discussed the circulatory system and the digestive system. These are the sort of the big three that get hammered a lot in high school, but we don't often get time or take the time to talk about some of the other systems. So we leave high school with this vague notion that there's other stuff going on. And then when you get to university, things become a little more specialized, and it's possible you may never ever understand how kidneys work or something like that. So what we'll do is we'll go through some of the other systems, and just briefly, we won't get into too much detail because in grade 12 you will study the kidney in more detail. You'll also study the nervous system in more detail, and so those two systems will get covered at that point when you take grade 12. But let's talk about them just briefly and sort of in general. Okay, so let's begin with the excretory system. And I like to talk about this because this is the system for removing waste products from your cells. And it's often confused with digestion. We often get confused between what comes out of the intestine and what comes out of the bladder. They're not really related to each other. In fact, they're two completely different systems. So, especially when you're a kid, you can imagine how you think, well, if I drink liquids through my mouth and I eat solids through my mouth, then when they come out, the two must be somehow the same system, but they're not. So the excretory system is essentially the kidneys, right, which are located in the back wall, along the back muscle wall of your abdominal cavity. So they're kind of closer to the back than they are to the front. That's why you get a kidney punch, right? The back part of your, and of course, if you do get trauma there, it can damage the kidney. It can cause bleeding. You can have blood in your urine and things. Usually it's temporary, but it could be serious. Then what there are two very small tubes that leave the kidneys and join up with the bladder. So it's a very simple system in terms of structure. And then there's a tube from the bladder that basically goes out of the body. And of course, it's a little bit of a longer tube for boys than it is for girls, but it's basically the same thing, right? So we have here the kidney. We have the tube, which is called the ureter. We have the bladder. And lastly, we have the urethra. Those are the sort of components of this system, at least the macroscopic components, the big components. Your bladder is situated very low in your intestine, or in your abdominal cavity, down sort of below your intestines, just below your belly button, sort of right in the. And you know, if you ever get a shot there, you know that it makes you want to pee a little bit. And so this is basically the system. So let's talk about just briefly how the kidney actually works and how it connects with the circulatory system. Because remember, the kidney has to somehow draw waste products out of cells. Well, the kidneys are not close to all the cells in the body, so of course the circulatory system is engaged to bring the wastes to the kidney, and then the kidney does its thing. So if you look at a kidney up close, here's a sort of an up-close picture of a kidney. Maybe I can draw this with a little bit smaller line and some different colors. So what I'll do is I'll draw this sort of light brown color. And up close, what we have in the kidney is sort of this big region like this. And then inside the kidney, there's sort of a darker region that kind of looks That's not very much darker, is it? Oh well, we'll make do. Which kind of goes up like this, and it forms these sort of regions of the kidney that kind of work inward like this. And the reason it looks like this is because on a microscopic level, these are actually a system of tubes. And all of these tubes enter into this area, right? Which is, there's sort of a little thing like this. So something like that. And if we color it in, let me use this color then. I'll use my crayon here. Do some nice, oh crap. Never works. Let's go back. Color, color, there we go. So this part of the kidney, this is called the cortex of the kidney. And it sort of goes like this. And then we have the darker part in the middle, which is called this actually should, I'm going to go over that line. It's kind of like that. This is called the medulla of the kidney. And it's two slightly different tissues. And then this sort of space here at the bottom, which I'll just kind of shade in a weird yellow color, is just a collecting area right here. That didn't come out very well. Let me go bright yellow. This is sort of a collecting area for everything that's draining from the kidney. So the kidney is really a set of tubules. And so there's a sort of a, oh, I'm still on crayon, aren't I? Pen. Wow. Dark. Maybe black and thin line. And so what we've got here is a tubular structure that drains. The kidney sort of, these are all tiny, tiny little tubes that are all draining this way. And so obviously we know that in this collecting area, the yellow area, it's called the renal pelvis. If you're interested in the names, this is the cortex on the outside part. It's the medulla, which is the darker region in here. And then this is called the renal pelvis, this collecting area. And then, of course, we didn't draw the tube, right? There's the tube that leads from the renal pelvis and goes down the ureter, which brings you to the bladder. So the yellow area is where the urine is being sort of funneled into from the rest of the kidney. So now let's do our magical biological blow-up thing, where we take a tiny region of the kidney like this, and we blow it up to have a look at what it looks like sort of really, really small. And what we find is that in that region, there's a very interesting thing. The kidney is made up of tiny little structures. They're very tube-like structures, which is why we drew those black lines. And they look something like this. They sort of have a little Pac-Man mouth, and then they have this sort of tube that wiggles, and then what happens is the tube takes a huge dip, like this, and then it dips back up, and then it wiggles a little more, and then it ends up going into what's called a larger tube, which runs here, and it's a collecting duct tube. So many of these little tubes would hook up together like branches of a tree and sort of hook onto this. I'm only going to draw one for simplicity, but there'd be all these. And what this thing is called is it's called a nephron. And that is the structure of the kidney up close. So those little black lines we drew, right, that show the tube structures are really look like this in greater detail. And if you were to take this picture, what's interesting about the kidney is that there's sort of a region here. The region up on top, now let me just get my crayon back again. Crayon, color, this color. The region up here is in the cortex of the kidney. That's where we find this part. But the lower region dips down into what's called the medulla. So this part is in the other part of the kidney, the dipping down of this tube. And that's a very important part of how the kidney works. In grade 12, you'll learn why. But it has to do with the different concentration gradients in the different tissues, which allows things to move in and out of the urine. Essentially, the job of the kidney is to get the stuff we don't want out and sort of retain the things that we do. So if you think about your bloodstream, what happens is the bloodstream comes in at this point. Thickness, let's go pen. Let's get the red artery coming in. And as the artery approaches, it branches into a capillary network, which is sort of all around the little Pac-Man head that we drew here. And what this does is it allows blood to come in, and in the capillaries, blood pressure pushes out basically almost everything that's in the blood. Everything small, that is. Not blood cells, they're too big. But it pushes out things like sugars and salts and dissolved things get sucked out into that little Pac-Man tube, which is, this whole thing is called, the Pac-Man tube is called the Bowman's capsule. We're not going to worry about all the names of this. This is just how the nephron works. And so all you need to remember is that everything that's in the blood goes into the tube and will eventually follow this tube, which leads out of the kidney and eventually becomes the urine. But if everything comes out of there, there might be good stuff we still want. So as the urine passes through this tubule, what happens is essentially along the way, things that are useful to the body can be drawn back into the body's tissues all the way along the tube. And things that are not useful can be left inside or taken back in. So what the kidney does is it essentially takes everything out of the blood at first. It's kind of like if you had to clean your room and it was a mess, and half the stuff was going in the garbage, but you didn't know which was which. You might decide to just take everything out of the room at once, and then just put back the things you want and then throw the rest away. You know what I mean? To make it easier? That's what your kidney does. It takes everything out of the blood, and then remember, what's in the black tube is urine. It's destined to be gone, to go out. So the green arrows mean that stuff that's in there is being sucked back into the body to be reused. And then eventually what happens is what comes out of the final tube and drains down this way, this is basically what we call urine. And it's made from a chemical called urea. And urea is a chemical that is essentially a waste product of the digestion of protein, the breaking down of proteins. And so urea is constantly building up in our blood because our cells are constantly rebuilding and shuffling around proteins, making new ones, breaking old ones. And this is what we call metabolic waste. Okay? You know that we have carbon dioxide and water as waste products from respiration, but there are lots of other waste products that are produced by a body because the cells are doing all kinds of other biochemical reactions with all those molecules that we had talked about. So urea is the molecule that comes out in the form of urine, and essentially urine is a solution containing urea. All right? Incidentally, if you ever look at hand creams, you might notice that one of the ingredients on the hand cream is urea. And that's because urea has been found to be a very good thing for skin. It actually helps heal skin that's irritated, right? Now that doesn't mean, of course, that somebody, peed in your hand cream. It just happens to be the same chemical. Remember that chemicals can be found in many different places and in many different things, right? There's also water in urine, but that doesn't mean that everything that contains water has pee in it. You know what I'm saying? But the chemical itself can be manufactured and put into hand cream. So urea is sometimes used for that purpose. Anyway, that's sort of the basic idea of the kidney and the nephron. Now, because the kidney works with blood pressure, one of the things that happens if you have chronic high blood pressure is it can damage the function of this Bowman's capsule, and it can cause kidney problems and kidney failure. So people with high blood pressure often have an issue with kidneys. Also diabetes, which means you have too much sugar in your blood. That also upsets the concentrations of things in these tissues, which are finely tuned to pull things in and out, and the kidneys can fail. They just can't do their job as effectively. So that's called our excretory system. Interesting side note, mammals make urea, but birds make a slightly different chemical. Birds make something called uric acid, which is very close in its sort of chemical makeup to urea, but not quite. That's why bird droppings, because they are a weak acid, they can, if they left on your car for a long time, they can start to make the paint discolor. They can react with things. Birds, of course, have a totally different system. In humans, we have a digestive system that has a tube that opens out the back, and then, of course, we have our kidneys, which open out the front. 2 different tubes for everything. But in the bird, it has a digestive system. Sorry, went up a little too far there. The bird has a digestive system that opens here, and then what happens is its excretory system for its uric acid enters into the same tube like this inside the bird, and everything comes out one place. It's called a cloaca. Sorry, a cloaca is how you pronounce it, a cloaca. And the interesting thing here, when you look at a bird dropping, you get all that white, gooey, milky stuff, and then there's a little chunky thing in the middle or two. Right? So what you're seeing is the mixture. The chunky thing in the middle has come from the digestive system. That's bird poop. And then the rest of it, the white stuff, is actually uric acid, or essentially bird pee. And it all just comes out at once, which is kind of interesting. Reptiles, I'm trying to think, there's also another major class of animals that makes a slightly different chemical, but I can't remember offhand what it is. Anyway, it's ammonia, and it's produced by, I don't think it's reptiles. I think reptiles and birds are both uric acid, but ammonia can also be used as a waste product for some things. Ammonia, what you notice about urea, uric acid, and ammonia is they all contain nitrogen. So think about it. We know how we get carbon out of the body through carbon dioxide, right, and water, hydrogen and oxygen, but nitrogen is the other big thing that's found in living things. So this is how you get rid of, we sometimes call it nitrogenous waste. That's the excretory system. Right? Kidney stones happen when the liquid that's in the renal pelvis right here, what happens is, because it's a liquid and it contains lots of salts, those salts can crystallize. They can turn back into solid instead of being dissolved. And it all depends on the concentrations. And so sometimes little bits of urea will crystallize like this and make tiny, tiny little stones. If they're tiny, it's not a big deal, because they can pass through the tube, go into your bladder, go through the urethra and out, and you wouldn't even know you had them. But the problem is if your urine is quite concentrated all the time, then what will happen is those stones will block the pathway. So let me go back up here. The stones will gather here. They'll be too big, and they'll have to push their way through this tube. And the pressure of pushing of the urine building up will push them through. When you look at these stones under a microscope, they look like this, these crystals. They're very sharp and pointy. So as they're pushed through the tubes, they cut and scrape and hurt. And kidney stones are extremely painful. And you have to wait for the stone to pass from your kidney down through the tube slowly, all the way down, and it could be hours and hours of pain until it drops into your bladder. Bloomp. And then you feel like, oh, I'm glad that's over, because that was crazy. But it ain't over, because then the stone finds its way into your urethra, and it begins to push and pull and grind and scrape again until it finds its way all the way out. So when you pass a kidney stone, that means you've suffered through 2 bouts of pain as the stone has gone through your system. And it will cause the tubes to bleed, you'll have blood in your urine, and apparently, I'm told, because I've never had a kidney stone, but I'm told that the pain is very intense. So you don't want a kidney stone, do you? No. The best way to avoid a kidney stone is to make sure that you're properly hydrated. If your urine is too concentrated, so that's a good point. What your body does is this. You see this loop here? This nephron? Hormones can affect how these green arrows and all this absorbing and moving of things is happening. So essentially, hormones can change the way the kidney works so that the urine can be made very, very concentrated, dark, yellow, thick urine, or very watery. So if you have lots of water available, because you're well hydrated, your body will say, okay, there's no shortage of water, use whatever we need to flush out the kidney, and it'll make very dilute, pale colored urine. But if you've just worked out, or you've been through the desert, or you haven't drinking a lot of fluids, your body will say, hey, we need this water. We can't afford to just, make it into pee and get rid of it. And so the kidneys will suck more water out of the urine to save it. And the urine will become very, very concentrated, dark yellow. And then when you pee that dark yellow, that means that it's very concentrated. It's okay to have dark yellow pee once in a while. Happens to all of us, and our kidneys are good at adjusting. But if you're constantly not drinking enough, and you're constantly having dark pee, concentrated, you're increasing the risk of those stones forming. So you don't want to have dark pee all the time. Ideally, you don't want to have dark pee ever. You want to have nice, light-colored pee. So it's amazing what you can tell by just what color your pee is. The other thing that you can tell from urine, which is interesting, we don't do this like we did in the old days. Now we have special machines and tests that we can run. But if you have a condition where you have too much blood sugar, like diabetes, sugar will enter into here through the bloodstream, and it will fill the urine. And the sugar will stay in the urine, so that when your pee comes out, it'll have sugar in it. So we can take urine and we can bring it to a lab and test it with machines. But in the old days, doctors would simply taste the urine to see if it was sweet or not. And if you had sweet tasting urine, that meant, oh, you might have diabetes. Thankfully, we don't do that anymore, right? Those doctors had to put up with a lot back then. All right, so there's the excretory system. That's kind of nice and simple. Another system, I don't know why my smartboard is overly sensitive today, but I'll try to avoid touching it with my sleeve. I think it's my sleeve that's dragging on it. Another system, the nervous system, is an important system. We're not going to talk much about that, but the nervous system, I'm just going to tell you very quickly that a nervous system is made of nerve cells. Here's a nerve cell. Nerve cells look something like this. They have these big, long projections that sort of branch and spike off like this, like that. And then coming out of here, there are little spiky projections as well. And so what nerve cells do is they connect to each other. So another nerve cell could connect to these. If I draw another nerve cell in red, it could connect to this one like this. There's another nerve cell, right? And it has another long extension that goes off to connect to another. And they just keep repeatedly connecting like this and to make these big, long chains of nerves through our body. And what's cool about nerves is the way they work. We often see pictures of, or movies or documentaries where they show the brain or nerves and they show little electric shocks going around. Your brain is electric, but it's not that kind of electric. There are no electrical shocks going through your brain. The electricity of your brain is what we call electrochemical. And it has to do with plus and minus ions, right, that are charged. And so your nerves have a special way of pumping ions. Open at the door? Okay. Okay, so what the nerve cell is going to do is it's going to pump like sodium ions and potassium ions in and out. And when it does that, then it creates an electrical gradient, which is how the the nerve signals travel along from nerve to nerve. So what I want to point out is it all has to do with chemistry, right? It's not so much electricity as such. It's actually just chemical ins and outs of ions that cause the electrical signals. And of course, the nervous system starts with your brain, right? And then your brain goes down to your spinal cord. And so the brain and the spinal cord constitute what we call the central nervous system. And then from there, nerves branch off to go to the rest of your body. And the nerves, of course, are there for messaging and control. We also have a muscular system. The muscular system of the human body is quite intense. Sometimes we call it the musculoskeletal. We kind of put it all together. And that's because muscles, at least human muscles, work as ropes, essentially. They're like ropes, and the ropes need to pull on something. So the musculoskeletal system is essentially how the muscles and bones work together to create movement, right? And of course, the way that works is like this. If we draw ourselves a little arm, well, there are two big muscles in the arm. There's a muscle up here, right? And then there's another muscle sort of nestled back here, a smaller one. And then the arm bone is sort of, well, the shoulder is a round bone that goes into your shoulder. And then there's a bone under here. And then this is your elbow joint, right? And then there's another set of bones that go this way. There's two of them actually in your forearm. There's one here, and then there's another thin one sort of underneath. And then there's the bones of your wrist. And then all the tiny little finger bones that form the hands. And so on. The thumb here. And so what happens is, in the musculoskeletal system, the muscle is usually attached to something called a tendon. And the tendon connects the muscle to a bone. So we have a tendon in green, which connects muscle to bone, and we have the muscle in red. And so what happens is the muscle, when it contracts, it shortens, and it pulls on that little green tendon, which is like a string, and it basically pulls on the bone and lifts up the arm. So when this muscle contracts, the arm will lift up this way. There's also a tendon attached to this smaller guy, which comes around like this and loops around and attaches to the bottom. So when this muscle contracts or shrinks, it pulls the arm back this way. And what we find about muscles is they often work in pairs. There's one that pulls one way and one that pulls the other, right? They have like a system where the two work together to create motion in both directions. One opposes the other. In the human, this big muscle is called the bicep in the arm, and this other one is called the tricep. Typically, human biceps are larger muscles because humans use our arms more for lifting. The motion of lifting the arms up is far more prevalent and useful to us than the motion of straightening out the arm. We don't need a big muscle to do that because we don't usually push things away. If we push, we're always, using it's our lifting muscle. The bicep is more of a lifting muscle, and the tricep is more of a pushing muscle. And that's just an example. If you look at the legs, if you look at all the different parts of the skeleton, you'll find these muscle pairs that are all just sort of interacting with the skeleton. And of course, the skeleton links to the muscle through the tendons. So when you have a sprain, right? If you sprain your ankle, for instance, there's possibly a tendon that's been stretched a little too much, and it's sore and it has to heal. There is another thing you might have heard. It doesn't really have anything to do with muscles, but it does have something to do with bones, and that is what's called a ligament. A ligament is a bone-to-bone tissue connection that keeps the joints lined up, so they're not involved in muscles. You can also stretch and tear ligaments, right? Many of you have heard in the back of your knee, if you think about the knee, the bones of the knee, there's your little kneecap right here, and then in behind there, there's the knee joint, right? In that little joint, there's a very strong X-shaped tendon. It's cross-shaped, so it's called cruciate, which is Latin for cross-shaped. And there's what we call the anterior and the posterior, the lateral. There's all different names for where they're situated. But many people tear their ACL, their anterior cruciate ligament. And when you tear that ligament, the thing about ligaments is they don't really heal that well, and they can become permanently stretched. So if you continuously stress a joint when you've stretched the ligaments will become stretched, and the joint will be forever looser than it was. And it'll pop out of alignment, right? The joint will pop in and out of alignment, and you'll have issues. The ACL does not heal on its own very well if you tear it. And that means your knee becomes very unstable. So often what they'll do is they'll take your other leg, which is healthy, right? Here's your other leg. And they will take some of the other ligaments. Besides the ACL, there are lateral ligaments here that are attaching on this side. And all these ligaments are there to keep the knee nice and tight and stable. So what they'll do is they'll take a little slice of this. There's a wide ligament here, and they can take like a piece of it. So the ligament looks like this. They cut out a piece like that. They take the piece from here, and they put it in there. Sew it in and repair the ACL. And that way you can do sports again, and your knee becomes more stable. So that's something that you may have heard of, torn ACL, right? That's a ligament. So ligaments are connectors between two bones, whereas tendons are a connection between a bone and a muscle. That's the difference. Tendons are a little more, they can endure a little more stretching and pulling and damage than ligaments can. So you don't want to tear ligaments, and you want to be careful. Yeah. So there's your musculoskeletal system. If you find that interesting and you want to learn more about that, there's a kinesiology course in grade 12 you can take, and that's a heavy part of it, is understanding the entire musculoskeletal system and all of the little connections and, this little guy right here, the skeleton that we have. But that's a basic idea of how your muscles work with your bones. Are there any other systems you're interested in? The reproductive system, of course, I think we kind of know how that works. It's pretty straightforward. There's lots of hormones involved in that, and of course, if you go into grade 12, you might study some of those hormones in more detail. There's also what we call the lymphatic system. This is one that nobody ever talks about until you get to med school. The lymphatic system is an interesting system, and basically, besides blood, there's another fluid in your body, and it's called lymph. Lymph. And lymph is basically a fluid that bathes all of your cells. It's the gooey fluid around all your cells. If you've ever popped a zit, after you get all the gooey white stuff and the blood stops, you might notice this clear amber-colored liquid that kind of comes out. Well, a lot of that is lymph. And lymph is a system. It's connected to the circulatory system, so it works in conjunction with it. But typically, if I draw myself a little body here with a head and some arms and some legs, whoops, what happened there? Some legs, very generalized human body. Lymph vessels are very tiny. They're very, very tiny. If you were doing a dissection, you wouldn't even be able to find them very likely, unless you really knew what you were doing. And these tiny little lymph vessels are found all through the body, and they connect up with the circulatory system, and then they also connect up to little things called lymph nodes, which are little lumpy nodes, and you can feel them under your skin. Typically, there's a bunch in your groin that handle the lymph that comes from your legs. There's a whole bunch all through your abdomen. And there's some under your armpits, and there's some in your neck, right? And these lymph nodes are tiny little, so the lymph vessels run through your body, and then they run into these big sort of lymph nodes, and then they run on through. And the lymph nodes serve to move the lymph. The main thing that moves lymph, though, is muscle contractions. These are all in between all your muscles. So if you have a big muscle here, every time it squeezes and pushes and pulls, it creates pressure inside here that squeezes and moves the lymph. So guess what's good for moving lymph? Exercise. Another problem that we have, not enough exercise. The lymph nodes themselves are collecting places. And what happens with lymph, what's interesting, is it often is the spot where infection will start. Because the lymph node, as viruses or little bacteria or things in your bloodstream are passing into the lymph, they sometimes end up in these lymph nodes, and the lymph node is kind of there on purpose to trap it. It's like a little thing, so, oh, you can't go any further. And it traps these germs, and then the white blood cells come in and attack it, and the lymph node gets swollen because it's busy fighting germs, and it's all swollen and full of fluid. So doctors will feel under your chin, and they'll feel your lymph nodes when they examine you to see if you have possibly an infection. A swollen lymph node can indicate something going on. So that's kind of like something the doctor checks. They often check under here, right? Tonsillitis. Not tonsillitis, sorry, mumps, I mean. Mumps is swollen lymph nodes. Mumps occurs in here, and you get these bumps, and the doctor can feel them. So that's the lymphatic system. One of the reasons the lymphatic system is very important is because many types of cancers will travel from parts of the body to another part of the body through the lymph, not the blood. And doctors have to know that. And they can try to trap cancers that are moving by removing lymph nodes. If a cancer is started in the leg and they remove the tumor by surgery, just in case any cells might have spread, those cells would have traveled up the lymph and got stuck in one of the lymph nodes in say, the upper leg or the groin area. So what they can do is they can go and take out the lymph node. And they can tell which one it is because they can inject radioactive dye into where the original tumor was. It's really cool. And then the dye will go right to the lymph node that those cancer cells would have went to. And then they can take that lymph node out just to be safe, and they can actually test it and see if the cancer has spread. So they use it as a diagnostic way to determine if your cancers have spread. So that's a very important aspect of our lives, right? Cancer is one of the things that humans suffer from that we're having a hard time battling. And it's a big health issue. So that's why the lymphatic system is quite important. All right, so there's the lymphatic system, which is hardly ever talked about. And I think we'll call it quits there. That's probably a few little extra interesting things for body systems. And you'll, of course, learn more about this in grade 12 and if you go on in university.